Hi everyone, welcome to this session, and in today's session we will be learning how to weaken an argument. So let's get started. So when it comes to weakening an argument, these questions require you to identify an option which weakens the conclusion of the argument. Remember, you need to weaken the conclusion of the argument. So essentially, you're looking for an answer option which has to identify a faulty assumption by introducing an additional premise or an additional piece of information, right? And when you negate the right answer choice, it actually strengthens the conclusion. So when you actually negate a weakener, what you get is a strengthener. Now, the most important thing when it comes to weaken an argument is the conclusion. Now, conclusion is a part of the argument that is most likely to be attacked, but the correct answer choice will not simply contradict the conclusion. Remember, we are not contradicting the conclusion. Instead, the correct answer will undermine the conclusion by showing the conclusion fails to account for some elements or possibility. So we are actually looking for an option which, in a sense, highlights the weakness in the way the author comes to his conclusion. Or basically, we are attacking the assumption and the argument. Now, in this sense, the correct answer often shows that the conclusion does not necessarily follow from the premise, even if the premise are true. So it's quite important that you understand the conclusion of the argument, whether you want to strengthen the argument or you weaken the argument. So let's see how Gmat tests you on weakener. Now, these are some of the typical ways by which Gmat frames question stems. For example, which one of the following, if true, more seriously weakens the argument? Remember, the key thing or the key aspect here is the words being used here. Most seriously weakens the argument. Look at the next question. Which one of the following, if true, most undermines the researcher's argument? So undermine is another word which is used by the author. Which one of the following, if shown to be a realistic possibility, would undermine the argument? Undermine is a word which is used generally to suggest a weakener. Which one of the following, if true, would most call into question? So that's another way Gmat frames these sort of question. When you call an argument into question, means you're actually asking to weaken the argument of the author. Let's try to understand how a wrong answer option would look like. A typical wrong answer option will have information which contradicts the information. For example, instead of weakening an argument, an option would strengthen the argument, right? So here you need to understand what exactly you need to weaken, right? You need to understand the entire conclusion of the argument, which will help you to understand the argument better, which will also in turn help you to choose an option which undermines or weakens the conclusion. Now, point number 2, shell game answers. Now, this is quite important. Now, what is a shell game answer option? When it comes to a shell game answer option, here you are going to encounter an answer option which looks very attractive, right? Basically, the option will have some information which is taken from the passage or from the argument. So you need to be very careful, right? We are not choosing an option which has similar piece of information. We are actually looking for an option which undermines the line of reasoning of the author. So that's the second important thing which you need to keep in your mind. And the third is an out of scope answer option. Now, an out of scope answer option is an option which does not touch upon the conclusion, right? It says something different from what is stated in the argument. Now, this is quite easy for most of the test takers to spot. But be careful with shell game answer option and the opposite answer options. So let's try and do one weakener. As always, you've got to read the question stem. Now here it says, which of the following, if true, most seriously calls into question the argument? So the word seriously calls into question suggests that this is a weakener. So let's read the argument. Argument goes like this. Driving the steep road to the mountaintop Inca ruins of Machu and Picchu is potentially dangerous, and hiking there is difficult. Now, the Peruvian government is installing a cable car that will make access much easier and hence result in a large increase in tourism. However, since the presence of large number of tourists tends to accelerate the deterioration of a site, installation of the cable car is certain to result harm to the ruins. Now, as always, when you're given an argument, the first and foremost thing is to identify the conclusion of the argument, right? So what's the conclusion? Now, generally, most of the GMAT question will have a conclusion marker. Now here, as you can see, however, suggests a concluding remark by the author. So what does the author say? What's the author's opinion, right? He says that since the presence of a large number of tourists tends to accelerate the deterioration of a site, installation of the cable car is certain to result in harms to the ruins. So what he says is, if you install cable car, that's going to increase the deterioration, or it's going to result in the harm to the ruins, right? Now, on what basis the author comes to the conclusion? Remember, always ask a question why to the conclusion, right? Why does the author believe installation of cable car is going to result harm to the ruins? Now, the reason, if you look at it, one of the reasons, as the author says, if you have cable cars, or if you encourage cable cars, you will have more number of tourists, right? And if you have more number of tourists, you will have more amount of deterioration or more harm to the ruins. So all these are interrelated, right? So cable cars increases the number of tourists, increase in the number of tourists means increase in the amount of ruins. Now, we need to weaken the argument, right? We need to look for an option which says that installing cable car is not gonna harm the ruins, right? Or it's not gonna create more problems, right? That's what we are looking for. So let's look at each of the option. So option A says the daily number of tourists that are expected to take the cable car to Machu and Picchu is smaller than the original resident population of Incas. Now, what does it talk about? It talks about the number of tourists, right? They are smaller, right? The number of tourists who are expected to take cable cars is smaller than the resident population. Now, does that have anything to do with the argument? My argument is whether installation of cable car is going to harm the ruins or not. So A is a classical out of scope option, so you could eliminate it. Let's look at B. The construction of the cable car terminal at Machu Picchu will require the use of potentially damaging heavy machinery at the site. What does it say? It says if you construct the cable car terminal, right, that would potentially use damaging machinery, right? It would use potentially damaging heavy machinery. Now, in a sense, it's strengthening my argument, right? Instead of weakening, it supports my conclusion, right? In a sense, it says cable cars are going to create problems. So that's not what I'm looking for. So B can be eliminated. Option C says Machu Picchu is already one of the most popular tourist sites in Peru. Again, we are not concerned whether it is an already popular tourist site or not. We are only concerned whether cable car is going to harm the ruins or is it better. So C is wrong. Let's look at D. D says natural weathering will continue to be a more significant cause of the deterioration of Machu Picchu than tourist traffic. Now, it gives you another factor, right? It talks about natural weathering, which is going to cause deterioration to Machu Picchu tourists rather than the tourist traffic. But again, it does not talk about whether installation of cable car is going to have the impact. So remember, you need to identify the conclusion and weaken the conclusion. So D is also gone. Now, let's look at E. The cable car will replace the tour buses whose large wheels and corrosive exhaust at present do significant damage to the site. Now, what does this say? This says, or option E says, that cable car is actually replacing the tour buses, right? And what do we know about tour buses? Their large wheels and corrosive exhausts at present do significant damage to the site. So what we are trying to say in option E is cable car is going to replace the tour bus, which is creating a lot of damage to the site. So in a sense, you're saying that it's not the cable car which is creating the problem. In fact, it's actually reducing the problem. So it weakens my conclusion. So the right answer option is option E. So I hope you're clear with this. So let's do one more question and see if we can do this. So let's read the argument. Before we read, we got to read the question stem. So what does the question stem say? It says, which of the following, if true, most seriously weakens the guidebook writer's argument? So you got to weaken the guidebook writer's argument or his conclusion. So let's see what the guidebook writer says. He says, I have visited hotels throughout the country and have noticed that in those built before 1930, the quality of the original carpentry work is generally superior to that in the hotels built afterward. Clearly, carpenters working on hotels before 1930 typically work with more skill, care, and effort than carpenters who have worked on hotels built subsequently. Now, what is he trying to say? Let's try to understand the conclusion of the argument. So the author says that carpenters working on hotels before 1930 typically worked with more skill, care, and effort than carpenters who have worked on hotels built subsequently. Now, that's your conclusion, right? That's the conclusion of the argument. Now, on what basis the author comes to this conclusion that these carpenters who worked before 1930 have more skill and care than those carpenters who come subsequently? The premise says that he has visited a lot of hotels, right? And what he has observed is those hotels which were built in 1930, prior to 1930, the quality of original carpentry work is superior to that of hotels built afterwards. So this is your premise. So based on this premise, the author comes to a conclusion that these carpenters, right, the carpenters before 1930 had more skill. They worked with more skill, care, and effort. Now, you need to weaken that argument. You need to say, hey, it's not that these guys have more skill or they put more care. It's something else, which is a cause of, the quality of original carpentry that he's talking about, right? So let's look at each of the options. So option A says, the quality of original carpentry in hotels is generally far superior to the quality of original carpentry in other structures such as houses and stores. Now, here, we're not concerned whether original carpentry in hotels is superior to other structures. We are concerned with the quality of carpentry in hotels prior to 1930 versus post 1930, right? That's what we are concerned. The entire argument is about the quality of carpentry prior 1930 versus post 1930. So this has nothing to do with the argument. So A is gone. Let's look at B. Hotels built since 1930 can generally accommodate more guests than those built before 1930. Again, are we concerned? We're not concerned about this aspect, right? We're not concerned whether they can accommodate more guests or fewer guests. What we are concerned is the quality of original carpentry in hotels prior 1930 versus post 1930. So you need to weaken that particular point, right? The point that prior 1930, you have greater quality, right? Now let's look at option C. It says the materials available to carpenters working before 1930 were not significantly different in quality from the materials available to carpenters working after 1930. Now, what does it talk about? It talks about materials available to carpenters, right? And it says these materials were not different, right? Which means both the set of carpenters, pre-1930s, post-1930 carpenters used similar quality of material. Now, if that is the case, will it weaken the argument that pre-1930 carpenters worked with more skill, care, and effort? No, it does not, because here we don't know about the quality. It doesn't talk about the quality of the original carpentry. It talks about the material being used, right? So we are concerned about the quality of carpentry, not the material being used. So C can be eliminated on that count. Now let's look at D. Now D says the better the quality of original carpentry in a building, the less likely that the building is to fall into disuse and be demolished. Now you would consider it as an out of scope option, right? We are not talking about demolition, right? We are not talking about disuse. But just look at this option, right? It says that if the quality of original carpentry is better, right, those structures will not be demolished or will not go for disuse. Now, what does it say? It says that if you have a structure which is good, right? If you have a hotel with good carpentry, it would not go for disuse or it will not be demolished. So essentially, when you look at the argument, the entire argument falls apart here, because here the author talks about carpentry of those hotels which are still present. So what about those hotels which are not present, right? So we don't know anything about it. So the hotels that the author is talking about are those hotels which have really good carpentry. So this weakens the entire argument by saying that the entire sample that the author uses does not represent the whole gamut of hotels. So that's what we are looking for. Um, so option D is the option that we are looking for. Let's look at E. E says the average length of apprenticeship for carpenters has declined significantly since 1930s. Now, again, does that have anything to do with the argument? Does it say anything about the quality of original carpentry, right? So unlike option D, right, option D clearly talks about the quality of original carpentry. That's exactly the point in the argument. Here in option E, it talks about the length of apprenticeship, and it has nothing to do with the quality of original carpentry. So E can be eliminated. So the right option is option D. So I hope it's a very useful session for you. So in the next session, we'll be focusing on one more aspect on critical reasoning. So thank you for watching.